Welcome back to Pod Save the World. I'm Tommy Vietor, and we have a great show for you this week. Here is how it's going to go. First, you are going to hear my interview with Oleksiy Sorokin. He's from the Kyiv Independent. We're going to talk about all the latest news from the ground in Ukraine. He is just an incredibly impressive human being and journalist, and it was a really powerful interview, as I think you'll hear in a second. Then I'm going to walk you through some of the other big headlines from Ukraine and from around the world this week. I am a little sad that of all the weeks Ben decides to take a break because he is a workaholic, it's the week we get more detail about just how corrupt and immoral and depraved Jared Kushner is and how thoroughly he sold his soul to the Saudi government for a multi-billion-dollar kickback from his bonesaw buddy, Mohammed bin Salman. But I'll raise that with Ben next week. You'll get to hear from him in this one. I get to say my piece on Pod Save America. I suspect we'll also talk about the Trump administration's failure to record all the gifts they got from foreign officials. What a shock that those scrupulous, well-meaning officials over there on Team Trump, State Department, DOD, White House, wherever else they were, just never wrote down all the free shit they got. Very, very above board. So without any further ado, let's get to our interview. My guest today is the political editor and COO of the Kyiv Independent, Oleksiy Sorokin. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Oleksiy, yesterday there were reports that Russian troops may have used chemical weapons in Mariupol. U.S. officials say that they haven't been able to confirm these reports. I saw the Pentagon say that, and Tony Blinken, the Secretary of State, today. I know the city has been under siege for weeks. It's hard to get information in and out, or at least to get journalists in and out. And it can take some time to confirm chemical weapons use under any circumstances. But can you help us understand what's been alleged or reported so far?
Yes, Ukraine also doesn't confirm chemical weapon use. Right now, the deputy defense minister says that it might been phosphorus munition. So obviously, we don't know what was used. But according to those on the ground, they say that many have eye rash, have a hard time breathing, and all the symptoms that some kind of chemical was used. We still don't know what it was, and I think that it's going to be impossible to prove this case.
Yeah, and obviously the details matter a lot here because, we saw in Syria that, something like a sarin gas or a VX gas may be used. It took a while to confirm that, but also, chemicals like chlorine gas can be highly toxic. They can terrorize and kill civilians, but they're not listed as a chemical weapon or banned under the Chemical Weapons Convention. I think the same is true for white phosphorus, if that's what they're saying was used here. That's an incendiary weapon, meaning it's often used to create smoke or to light up an area. But if it gets on you, it can literally burn through your skin and burn through the bone. It's a horrific, horrific weapon. But again, not viewed as a chemical weapon by the OPCW. So complicated.
Yeah, and technically it's not banned. So Russia can point to this, that it's not a chemical weapon use.
Right. I saw, and I know you saw this as well, some journalists were cautioning that the source of these reports about potential chemical weapons use were from the Azov battalion. Therefore, we need to treat them with skepticism, given who the Azov battalion are. I see that a lot over here. Critics of Western support for Ukraine point to the Azov battalion and the fact that there are some right-wing nationalists and maybe even neo-Nazis within the organization as a way to sort of tarnish Western support for the war effort. Can you help us understand the broader context of like who the Azov battalion are and how they fit into the Ukrainian defense and maybe political infrastructure?
Sure. Well, the first thing to point out here is that using chemical weapons on people should be banned, and no matter who reports that.
Yeah.
Concerning Azov battalion, the trick here is that the Azov battalion that was created in 2014 when Russia first invaded Ukraine and launched its invasion of Donbass, and the Azov battalion right now, it's completely two different structures. Back then, the battalion was created by Kharkiv Ultras, basically football hooligans, obviously many of whom were far right, some of them were neo-Nazis, and that's the source of information that many people in the West get. Basically, they saw that there were neo-Nazis in Azov in 2014. They carry it to 2022, and they say that the battalion is Nazi. What happened later? In 2015, Ukraine basically decided that those volunteer battalions should be incorporated into the Interior Ministry, into the National Guard. And obviously, it checked everyone who was part of this group. Those who had far right views were cast aside, and now the Azov regiment is basically a department of the National Guard. So it still has the same insignia, it still has the same history, but I would say that less than 5% of those who were part of this battalion in 2014 are still part of the battalion now. Um, Also, we know that the Russian propaganda used this case to frame Ukrainian volunteers as neo-Nazis. This is obviously not true. If we look at, for example, Ukrainian parliamentary elections in 2019, then far-right parties in total received 2%. A bit over 2%. Obviously, they didn't make it into parliament. And even Azov's leader, Bieletsky, who was a lawmaker in 2014, he didn't run. And the party he represented didn't run in the parliamentary elections. If we look, for example, in Germany, there's AfD, which has over 10%. Marine Le Pen.
Yeah, I was going to say France.
Yeah, in France, she's in the runoff in the presidential elections. We also know that there's a lot of problems with far-right groups in the States as well. So pointing to one group, which is pretty marginal, and saying that, A, Ukrainians are neo-Nazis, and two, that the report of chemical weapons being used is not true, I think it should be cast aside, this notion.
That's incredibly helpful context. Stepping back a little bit, I mean, there are new reports almost every day about civilian casualties, about war crimes by Russian forces. There's the occupation of Bucha, the shelling of a railway station full of civilians and kids over the weekend. The mayor of Mariupol says 10,000 civilians have been killed. Chernihiv was under siege for weeks. I know that you personally, your team, you've been visiting some of these places. I mean, what has that experience been like for you, and what have you seen?
I think it's first reaction you get is shock. You see this in movies about the Second World War, when there's like villages completely destroyed, where people are executed, women are raped, children are raped. You hear this and you think, okay, this can't be true. This is so horrific that you think that maybe we're exaggerating. Maybe these reports are not true. And then you go to the site, then you see this, then you see, for example, the town of Borodyanka, 40 kilometers northwest of Kyiv, completely destroyed. All high-rise buildings were bombed with airstrikes. There's under one building, they found, in the first day of rescue operations, they found 26 bodies. In the town of Chernihiv, which we visited, under one building, they found 47 bodies. And that's one building.
Yeah.
And when you walk those streets, destroyed streets, for example, in Bucha, when you walk the streets, you see people lying. You see people lying there for weeks. There's a certain smell. There's a certain picture of kids, women lacking body parts. There's tanks burned. There's buildings destroyed. And when you see this with your own eyes, you feel like something died inside. And especially when we're talking about Kyiv suburbs. I'm from Kyiv. I was born in Kyiv. I lived nearly all my life in Kyiv. I have friends who lived in Bucha, who lived in Irpin. Those are pretty well-established suburbs. For example, in Irpin and Bucha, a lot of young Ukrainians were buying houses or had a mortgage. And when you hear your friends having their apartments destroyed, the friends of your friends being killed, their parents being killed, uh, you think that, well, your life won't be the same. This is something that changes your life.
Yeah. I mean, the other horrifying report I saw over the weekend, I think, was some Ukrainian officials were saying that more than 100,000 children have been forcibly deported, kidnapped would be a better word, to Russia by the Russian government. They say that Russia may be changing its laws to fast track the adoption of Ukrainian children. That is obviously one of the most evil things I've ever heard. I think that is clearly a genocidal behavior. Do you know where these estimates are coming from? Are these children who primarily live in eastern Ukraine?
Yes, what happens is that in Donbass and in cities encircled in Russia, Russia basically forces people to flee to Russia. It says that, okay, we're going to allow a humanitarian corridor, but only to Russia, right? And if you are a family with a small child and you have an option either to sit in a basement in Mariupol and die of starvation, of dehydration, or take your chances and try to flee even to Russia, obviously you will take that chance. And we see that in the Kharkiv region, in Donetsk region, in Luhansk region, well, where Russia, for the sake of its own propaganda, to show itself as the liberators, as the saviors of the people, it forces people to flee to Russia. And then obviously people have problems.
Mm-hmm.
Little kids are separated from their parents. Uh, Parents are interrogated, especially if it's men from 18 to 60. There some reports, this is unconfirmed reports, but some report that men were shipped to Siberia to basically live there uh, so that they can't return to Ukraine and pick up arms. The best account here is Ludmila Denisova, who's the ombudsman of Ukraine. She's a parliamentary representative for the human rights. She every day she publishes reports about systematic human rights violations, and it's hard to read that.
Yeah.
After Bucha, there were multiple cases of rape, of children being raped. There's also, yeah, I think it was yesterday in her interview to BBC, she said that around 25 women were kept in a basement in Bucha and systematically raped by Russians. And you read this every day. You start your morning by reading this news that children are kidnapped by Russia, children are raped, men are shot. You read this the whole day, then you write a story, then you edit a story, then you go to bed and you check the news, and you see, for example, defenders of Mariupol pleading for help and saying that Russia uses chemical weapons, and then you just sit there and you think that, how am I still sane? How am I still able to process this and to work and to continue to provide information if for the past 48 days I'm hearing just uh, war crime after war crime, and one uh, powerful neighbor completely trying to completely annihilate me, my family, and the people I love.
It's horrific. And, I mean, not that this is any consolation, but I mean, one of the things that has just been like staggering to me and to Ben, my co-host here, is the ability for people like you, I mean, Ukrainian journalists, to continue doing their jobs and reporting and keeping the world abreast of what's happening, and in doing so in such a factual and rigorous way. I mean, it's horrifying, but pretty extraordinary work. So you deserve credit for that. Um, you mentioned the pullback from Ukraine that the Russian forces made a couple weeks ago that allowed, access into places like Bucha. There's speculation that Russia might be refocusing their military efforts on the Donbass solely and are looking for some sort of success by May 9th, which is a major holiday in Russia where they celebrate their victory over the Nazis in World War II. Before, I guess, deciding to emulate them in 2022. Have those forces been brought into the fight yet? And if not, I mean, is there a sense of when that might happen?
Yes, according to both Ukrainian and Russian officials, those troops are moved. For example, those that were stationed near Kyiv are moved through Belarus, through Russia to Lugansk region. Those that were stationed near Chernihiv and Sumy are moved also through the neighboring Russian regions to Lugansk and Donetsk. We expect this, as it's now called, battle for Donbass, to begin maybe early next week because Russia has logistics problems. It's hard for them to basically uh, form battalions out of those scarce resources that were left near Kiev.
Right.
Ukraine has here a priority in shipping arms also to Donetsk, to Donetsk region, to Slavyansk, Kramatorsk. Ukraine can do it faster. Ukraine is using railways, which proven to be very effective of, for example, moving people out of war zones. They moved over several million people to the west. So everybody expects this battle to start any day now, probably closer to next week. And also, this is important to point out that now both Ukraine and Russia have paused any sorts of peace talks because both countries are banking on this battle. Russia on the offensive, Ukraine on the defensive. Here, Russia has a advantage, I would say, because when they tried this so-called blitzkrieg, this fast operation to conquer Ukraine in 3 days, they overestimated their resources and underestimated Ukrainian defenses. Now, obviously, they understand that they're against a very tough opponent, and now they will try to pack as many troops in one region to have uh, basically 5-1, maybe 7-1 in terms of troops, tanks, missiles, and so on. And here, Ukraine will have a problem. Here, Ukrainian mobile defenses, when they can hit supply lines, hit several tanks, and then move back. Here, it won't work because it's a very narrow strip here. You can't basically move out of Severodonetsk or Kramatorsk or Mariupol. So I think this will be a very, very hard battle for Ukraine to win. And that's why President Zelensky has increased his plea to Western leaders for them to provide heavy weapons, because he said it quite frankly today that without heavy weapons, we can't break the siege in Mariupol, and basically probably we can't win the battle in Donbass.
Yeah, it seems like the Russians have lots of stuff, tanks, armored vehicles, missiles, etc. But they might be short on infantry and troops with, any kind of morale left. Whereas Ukraine has some of the, bravest fighters I think we've seen in a long time, but maybe not enough material. I mean, to your point about Zelensky's plea for more stuff, weapons, etc., heavy weapons, Prime Minister Boris Johnson was in Kiev recently. I know he had talks with President Zelensky. He sort of walked around the city greeting people. Wondering how that visit was received and whether that visit has been matched with sort of a commensurate offer of more of the weapons you need.
Well, obviously, it was a photo op, right? We know that Boris Johnson likes shiny things. He likes to appear as the leader of the free world, as the Churchill of our time. That's one thing. The second is that he promised Ukraine more weapons. He promised Ukraine anti-tank weapons. He promised Ukraine some defensive weapons against Russian naval capabilities. That's what we're hoping for right now. Obviously, the number one priority for Ukraine is tanks and air defense. That's where we basically, obviously, are losing in comparison to Russia. The S-300s that we were asking, well, Slovakia was the first country to finally ship one S-300 battery. We need more. Uh, the S-300 is a Soviet-made air defense system, which Ukrainians can operate, meaning that we can just ship it to the east and it's already operational. So here, I think it's not what Boris Johnson can do. It's something that the US can do, basically swap the Soviet-made weapons that many Eastern European countries, part of the Warsaw Pact, have for new American,
Patriot,
for Patriot, basically air defenses. And we're hoping that the US will do it, but after US basically fumbled the case of MiG-29s, saying that US is not going to help transfer those planes, those jets to Ukraine. I think that now Ukraine is hoping more on the UK and Eastern European countries such as Poland and the Baltic states.
And it sounds like, I mean, the Germans initially had said that they were going to do a lot of things, like maybe the new chancellor is dragging his feet on cutting off Russian imports of oil and gas, and maybe dragging his feet as well on the delivery of armored personnel carriers. Is that right?
Yeah. There was this shocking situation where basically Germany decided to decommission 100 APCs instead of transferring them to Ukraine. So they just decided to destroy 100 military vehicles rather than providing them to Ukraine. Obviously, they were old. Obviously, Ukrainians don't know how to handle them, and you have to train Ukrainians. But just that was a shock. And Frank-Walter Steinmeier, the president of Germany, basically said today that he was willing to repeat Johnson's photo op and go to Kyiv, but Zelensky said no. And that's Ukraine's stance here, that we believe that Germany is doing not enough. We believe that Germany is partially responsible to the situation that's happening. First, because they were appeasing Russia for years. And second, because they are now choosing their comfort for Ukrainian lives. Because every bullet that Russia fires in Ukraine is sponsored by European countries that buy oil and gas. Russian oil and gas imports, exports of Russia and imports of the European Union account for 40% of Russia's budget. 40. That's if tomorrow the European Union says, okay, we're done, we're cutting off Russian oil and gas and coal, the war will end within a month.
Yeah. So last question for you, and thank you again for giving me so much time. I mean, I know people in the Biden administration listen to this, State Department, the Pentagon, whatever. What do you want them to hear from you and about what Ukrainians need, and about what the expectation is for the U.S., for NATO to deliver in these crucial weeks ahead in this refocus fight in the Donbass?
I think it's important for Western leaders to understand that it's not a war between the small country Ukraine against Russia. This is a war between the free world and a dictatorship. And Ukrainian survival, the survival of the Ukrainian nation, the Ukrainian state, is in the interest of the US, of Germany, of France. And if it causes a spike in gas prices or a fall, I don't know, in employment, a couple of percent, that's still worth taking than seeing Ukrainians die, than seeing Ukrainians being massacred, because this will be in history books. This will be the same history books that talk about the Second World War, the First World War, and you have to choose on which side of history you are. And helping Ukraine survive, this will obviously go down in history as a major win for democracy in the free world.
Oleksiy, thank you so much for talking with us, and Thanks for all the great work the Kyiv Independent is doing. Everyone should follow you on Twitter. I don't know. Can they help you out? Can they subscribe? What can people do to help you? You guys are working so fucking hard.
I think it's better to donate to Ukrainian organizations such as Come Back Alive and some humanitarian organizations that help, for example, the displaced refugees. I think that will be much appreciated in Ukraine.
Okay, we'll do that too. Thank you again, and have a great day. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to talk through a few more things that I saw in the news about Ukraine that didn't come up in the interview today, and then a couple other issues from around the world that I just think are worth noting. So the first thing I saw from Washington was the Biden administration is reportedly debating how much they are legally allowed to support a criminal investigation of Russian war crimes in Ukraine by the International Criminal Court. This issue is a little complicated for the United States and for President Biden because the U.S. isn't party to the treaty that created the International Criminal Court. The U.S. military mostly vigorously opposes the U.S. being a part of the criminal court because they don't want U.S. troops prosecuted at The Hague. So we're going to watch how this one plays out. Obviously, there's a lot of momentum to call President Putin a war criminal, to prosecute him and other Russian officials for war crimes. I suspect that the United States will be able to find ways to get evidence of Russian war crimes to these prosecutors without joining the treaty, but I am far from an expert here. We need you, Amal Clooney. Please come on the show. Walk us through this one. We've also talked in past episodes about how there's a debate over whether NATO expansion was a good idea, whether it went too far. The question is basically, did NATO unnecessarily antagonize Russian leaders, including Putin, by expanding further and further eastward and admitting countries closer and closer to Russia's border? Regardless of what you think about that debate, and if you really want to dig into it, you should go back and listen to my interview with Peter Beinart from several months ago. It now seems pretty clear that Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, whether or not it was the result of, NATO encroachment, will lead to more NATO expansion, not less. There are reports that both Sweden and Finland are currently debating whether to join, and there's polling in both countries that show support for joining NATO doubled in both countries. Funny how that happens when you fucking invade your neighbor. People suddenly want protection. So Finland will probably decide what to do in a few weeks. Sweden is more likely to decide, I think, during the summer. It might be an issue in their parliamentary elections in September. So great work there, Vladimir Putin. More strategic genius from the man over in Russia. Finally, the investigative journalist organization Bellingcat reported that there has been a massive Stalinist-like purge of Russian intelligence officials. They reported that nearly 150 FSB agents have been fired or moved, and that the head of the department responsible for Ukraine was sent to prison. There's been a lot of speculation lately, a lot of experts arguing that Putin's isolation, his ever-shrinking circle of advisors and friends, and his tendency to punish people who bring him bad news is part of why this military campaign has gone so badly to date, and why all the Russian assumptions about Ukraine have been wrong. Putin seemed to think that he could just gallop into Kyiv, that Zelensky would flee, that the Ukrainian military would roll over. The exact opposite happened. So we shall see what happens with all these, FSB agents and everybody else. Good luck to you, evil monsters. Sorry, you work in a system where the messenger sometimes literally gets shot. And speaking of which, best of luck to the new Russian commander of the war effort who was named over the weekend. In other news from around the world, French voters went to the polls on Sunday for the first round of a two-part presidential election. As expected, the runoff on April 24th will pit President Emmanuel Macron against right-wing zealot Marine Le Pen. In the first round, Macron got 27.8% of the vote. Le Pen got 23.2% of the vote. According to polling, Macron is the slight favorite going into the runoff, but I still think we should all be a little bit nervous about the way his lead shrank over the past few weeks and what the totality of these results tell us. So before I get to that, a little background. So Marine Le Pen and her party have a long history of anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-immigrant policies. There's been some vile anti-Semitism. She's a well-documented fan of Vladimir Putin. So if she's elected, it is bad news for a lot of reasons, and you can probably kiss French support for Ukraine goodbye. Le Pen barely beat out a leftist candidate named Jean-Luc Mélenchon. He took third place with 22% of the vote. Apologies for that accent. Mélenchon focused a lot of his campaign on populist economic issues like lowering the retirement age and creating a minimum wage. But, it's notable that he is also far more hostile than Macron to EU rules, and he's been a longtime critic of NATO. So, what I think these results tell us, the early results at least, is that racism and Islamophobia, dressed up in campaign rhetoric as a debate about language and culture, has resonated with a lot of French voters. So are messages that are critical of NATO, critical of the EU, critical of internationalism generally. Although it's worth noting that this time Le Pen did not run on exiting the EU. That previously had been a plank in her platform when she's run in the past. There was no Frexit pledge this time. But we can also see that populist economic policies are resonating as people everywhere deal with inflation and rising gas prices, and I think a global economy that is clearly just still a mess after the pandemic. So the question now becomes, can Emmanuel Macron get his shit together? Will he start campaigning hard? Can he attract enough votes from the left, or has he, disappointed them? And will those voters stay home or give Le Pen a shot? Mélenchon, the leftist socialist candidate, told his supporters that he doesn't like either candidates. He doesn't like Le Pen. He doesn't like Macron. But he said his voters can't let one vote go to Marine Le Pen in the second round. Notably, he did not say, vote for Emmanuel Macron. He said, don't let one vote go to Marine Le Pen. So there's a question there of whether he's sort of signaling stay home. This is Le Pen's third run. Last time, 2017, she went head-to-head in a runoff with Macron. He beat her handily. One reason for that was she did a terrible job in their debate, and that really hurt her. We'll see if she's improved. It's worth, again, remembering that Marine Le Pen's party got an $11 million loan from a Russian bank in 2014 that has ties to the Kremlin. That could be a far more salient issue now. She has had to try and hide her Putin love. In the past few months, there were a bunch of flyers that had her and Putin on them that they had to tear up or put away. She now says she supports sanctions on Russia, but not energy sanctions on Russia because she doesn't want to hurt French consumers. Obviously, sanctions on Russia that don't include energy are not particularly strong, but it'll be interesting to see if that kind of attempt at splitting the difference flies, and if Macron is tacked too far to the right. The last step in this process is going to be that a few weeks after the presidential election, there will be parliamentary elections. So whoever wins, but especially Le Pen, will not just have to win that election, but then find a way to form a government. So we'll watch that one very closely. The other issue we previewed last week that came to a head this week is Pakistani Prime Minister Imran Khan was finally ousted from his job on Sunday after losing a no confidence vote in parliament. Khan had tried to block that no confidence vote from happening by dissolving parliament before they could take the vote, but Pakistan's Supreme Court ruled that that move violated the constitution and allowed the vote of no confidence to proceed, and Khan got the boot and is now the first Pakistani prime minister to be removed by a no confidence vote in history. Parliament then named opposition leader Shahbaz Sharif to be the interim prime minister. That happened on Monday. If his name sounds familiar, it's because Sharif is the younger brother of former Prime Minister Nawaz Sharif, who last got thrown out of office over corruption allegations back in 2017. The younger Sharif now inherits a brutally difficult political environment with inflation, a powerful military that he too has to appease, and a pissed off former prime minister named Imran Khan, who is likely to run again, who's likely to whip up his supporters, and then elections that are likely later this year. So, in the past, Sharif has been accused of ordering extrajudicial killings and charged with corruption. So not a great outcome, I think, although maybe he'll provide some stability. One of the last things I wanted to cover is just this COVID lockdown in Shanghai, China. This isn't getting that much attention, I think, because, so much of the international news focus is on Ukraine. But again, this is the third largest city in the world. I think it's like 25, 26 million people. And parts of the city have been locked down for 2 weeks. And it's not like lockdown like we were locked down, like, you can walk the dog, Postmates is still delivering. Like, in some cases, people were literally locked into their homes or apartment buildings, like bolted from the outside. And today, April 12th, when we're recording, some residents were finally allowed out of their homes. But that really only came after videos and news reports emerged of people who were, screaming that they were literally starving. And there was a video of people trying to break into a supermarket. Others had run out of medicine. I mean, residents, they can't get food delivered because all the delivery people are locked down as well. And authorities have responded with, brutality, imprisoning residents, beating them. People who test positive have been forced into crowded, unsafe quarantine facilities. And, it doesn't seem like this draconian effort is even working, and really will lead everyone to question, I think, China's COVID-0 policy and whether it's sustainable at all. British Prime Minister Boris Johnson was fined by police for breaking coronavirus laws by attending a COVID party during lockdown that his own government had ordered. I'm curious how they decided which party exactly to fine him for, because there were so many, but apparently what got him this fine was his birthday party at 10 Downing Street. On Tuesday, Johnson said he had paid the fine. We don't know how much it was. He again apologized, but he refused to step down. London police say they will issue fines for at least 50 violations, including Johnson, his wife, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Boris seems to have been banking on the fact that Ukraine has distracted everyone from his partying ways. We shall see. When Parliament comes back into session, you have to think that they might raise this several times. They might raise the fact that it seems pretty clear that Boris lied to Parliament, lied to the British people about what was happening, and he could still be in some trouble. But really, it's up to members of his own party to decide to throw him overboard, to do a vote of no confidence. But we'll see if we get there. Thank you all for listening all the way to the end, even if it's just me solo, talking to myself, just me and a mic, waving at the producers and everybody. They can't talk back. Their mics aren't on. But anyway, thanks you guys. Ben will be back next week, and we'll talk to you soon.